year was 1999, and nu metal and post-grunge were reaching unprecedented levels of success. It was so big that it was fixing to be the new pop music with the numbers that it was doing. Hits after hits were being cranked out left and right. For a little while, it seemed that if you sounded like that, you were pretty much guaranteed success. Some of the bands were good, some of the bands were bad, and some simply rode the cultural wave and were doomed to fade into irrelevance after releasing one or two big songs. But among them all, one stood out, and still stands out to this day. 1999's Spit, released by a Canadian nu metal band called Kittie. It barely achieved gold certification. It produced one moderate hit, a song called Brackish, which today is still arguably the band's greatest hit. Yet somehow, this album still managed to outclass nearly every other nu metal and nu metal related album that came before and after it. So how did this happen? How did a debut album by a group of teenage girls manage to outdo albums by the pioneers of nu metal, by more successful bands in nu metal, and by more technically skilled bands in nu metal? Well, to answer that question, we're going to have to do a little bit of a history lesson. This is kind of a video essay, so, in true video essay form, I've got to start by giving you a little bit of history and context. So, nu metal and post-grunge has seen a remarkable and bizarre resurgence in popularity among people my age and younger in recent times. Nu metal and post-grunge songs have been trending on, TikTok. There's entire TikTok pages and Instagram pages devoted to this stuff now. Limp Bizkit is headlining festivals again. Creed is reunited for the second time, and they're back out on tour. But let me make one thing very clear to you. In the commercial heyday, the true commercial heyday of this music back in the period from around 1997 to 2003, this music's public perception was not as positive as the sales numbers would lead you to believe. People who had loved the alternative music of the early 90s, like Pearl Jam, Nirvana, and Alice in Chains, saw the post-grungers like Live, Collective Soul, and Bush as watered-down, more boring, not as good versions of what they had already heard in the early 90s. And the established metal community, the death metalers and thrashers of the late 80s and early 90s, just outright rejected nu metal. They did not claim it as their own. They even came up with a derogatory term for it to avoid classifying it as proper metal. They called it mallcore. And that is a tradition that still continues in many metal circles to this very day. And to the greater public, this music was kind of seen as a joke. I mean, how could you not, right? It's music for the young, dumb, angry man. It's got this lumbering, aggressively angsty, jaded, macho type of sound. It doesn't really make you think of good things. It makes you think of empty-headed gym rats. It makes you think of jock assholes, frat bros, holes punched in drywall, culture appropriating hairstyles, and if you're in modern times, then it probably makes you think of divorced dads. So yeah, not good things. And given all of this, it goes without saying that the genre at this point was a complete sausage fest. With the exception of Coal Chamber's bassist, Raina. The music was sorely lacking in female perspective and sensibility. And that fact is one of the many reasons that people attributed the absolute mayhem at Woodstock 99 to. Yeah, that festival didn't do any favors for nu metal and post-grunge's public perception. That festival was full of the stuff. And it was also full of audience members setting shit on fire, starting fights, tearing down equipment and shit. There was sexual assaults. People even died. This festival had a body count. Not the band body count. A body count as in people died. And who was the band that was most associated with this degenerate behavior from the audience? Limp Bizkit.
The Chocolate Starfish!
Yep, that tracks. So yeah, it wasn't a good look for nu metal. So who's gonna come along to change its face up a little bit? Who's gonna provide a new perspective, some new sensibility? A few years before all of this, in the year of our Lord 1996 to be precise, in the town of London, Ontario, Canada, land of the maple syrup drinkers, there were two middle school kids named Mercedes Lander and Fallon Bowman. They met while they were in gym class together, and they decided to start a band. So the pair started jamming in Mercedes' basement with Mercedes on drums and Fallon on guitar, and they needed a vocalist. So pretty soon, Mercedes' big sister, Morgan, made her way down to the basement, and she could sing and play guitar, so she became the vocalist and their second guitarist. So now they had 3/4 of the traditional rock ensemble. Now they needed a bass player. So they got Tanya Candler, another schoolmate of theirs, to play bass, and that was that. They started playing shows, they started, doing battles of the bands and stuff, started gaining momentum. And during one show happened to be high profile enough to where there was a record executive from NG Records in the crowd. So he happened to stop by. It must have been a pretty good show because Kittie got signed to NG Records shortly afterwards. Kittie's grinding it out in the scene for 3 years had finally paid off. They had the shows under their belt. They had the songs. They now had the record deal. So now it was time for the culmination. Recording an album. They hit the studio in the middle of 1999 with Garth Richardson on production duties. He had previously produced notable albums for bands like Rage Against the Machine. And finally, in late 1999, Spit was released. The debut album, the culmination of 3 years of hard work. So, what were the results like? Yep, this is a nu metal album, alright. It starts off with pretty standard nu metal fare. The music is sounding very familiar. It's got a dumb, big, loud, stupid 3-note riff. The vocals are harsh and screamy, but something's different. There's a vibe that's different. Remember how I was talking a little bit ago about how nu metal is a generally dumb and macho kind of music? Well, then it stands to reason, doesn't it, that as soon as it's played by people who aren't dudes, that the vibe would immediately change just on that merit? Well, let me tell you, on Spit, it certainly does change. So, Kittie's coming out the gate with a bang. They're not coming out soft, they're coming out swinging. But they're not doing it the Limp Bizkit way, where, they just loudly announce their presence and then warn you that you'll be knocked the fuck out.
Take a look around. Limp Bizkit fucking up your town. L-I-M-P, Bizkit is right here. You get knocked the fuck out.
No, rather, Kittie's gonna take their rage out in a much more forward-thinking way. It almost seems like they've set out on this album to be a counter with their music to every type of gross man imaginable. They go after misogynists. They go after groomers. They go after abusers. They go after stalkers. And slut shamers. They go after people who doubted that they could play heavy music just because they were women. Which was a big problem for Kittie. Like, people were accusing them of having their shows backtracked, like having men standing behind the stage and playing their instruments for them.
My favorite was even just being on tour with a band that was like, you guys are on tracks. I was like, where are these magic tracks coming from? Where? Look at our drummer. How is she running it? There's a ghost cable.
Ghost cable.
There's a ghost computer. There's a ghost
unit
on the stage. And they were just saying, like, there's no way that you guys sound like that. I was like, there is when you practice every day.
All kinds of horrible lies were spread about this band in their early days just because they were women and an overwhelmingly masculine type of music. So, there is no doubt in my mind that Kittie legitimately went through all of the things that they talk about on this album. So the album's rage and bluster comes from a very real place, and there's no better musical backdrop for it than nu metal, honestly. From the very beginning, nu metal has been a very emotive and expressive genre, giving a voice to people who, really didn't have music that talked about their struggles in such a blunt, relatable fashion. On the very first Korn album, widely considered to be the origin point for nu metal, Jonathan Davis was talking about his experiences with homophobia, his experience with child sexual abuse, his experiences with mental health struggles, and his screwed up childhood. So that's always kind of been what the good part of nu metal is about. And that's what Kittie decides to use it for rather than just dumb, empty rage. Musically and with the lyrical stylings, Spit sits right up there with everything else of the day. But it doesn't sound like it's angry just for the sake of being angry. It's, why do I get shit all the time from you men? You are swine. You think dick is the answer, but it's not. All sentiments that have aged very well. This whole album's attitude and lyrical themes have aged very well. And they were a much needed counterweight against the image and people that were playing in nu metal at the time. And all they had to do was change two things. Only two things, but two big things nonetheless. The gender and perspective from which this music is written. And just by doing that, they absolutely turned nu metal on its head, and they ended up being very memorable for it. But this album isn't just carried by the lyrics and, the novelty of the people playing it either. That's another big thing that got on Kittie's nerves back in the day, too. Like, everybody who interviewed them was like, what's it like to be a bunch of teenage girls playing nu metal?
The way that people would position the questions, like, what does it feel like to be an all-girl band?
It's like, how do I know?
Yeah, it's like, what are they trying to get at? What do they mean? What does that mean? And when you're asking like a 16-year-old girl, what is it like? Like, you want us to be like, hey, we freeze our bras at night, and we do like pillow fights and ha ha ha.
They clearly demonstrate that they also know the musical moves of nu metal inside out. They know what to do musically. They've got the stupid 3-note riffs. They've got the vocal stylings. They even do the vocal move that I like to call white knuckles, which is where you start out a line real quiet and then you repeat it over and over until it gets really loud. They do that in the song Do You Think I'm a Whore? And I mean, yeah, the riffs sound like the first riffs you ever write on the guitar. Yeah, brackish bears more than a striking resemblance to Loco by Cold Chamber. Paper Doll kinda rips off Sober by Tool a little bit. But, they can get away with it. Nu metal sounds like the first guitar riffs you ever write. That's how it's supposed to sound. And in these girls' case, it literally was the first guitar riffs they ever wrote. And I think that in some ways they even have musical sensibility that's beyond their years, and they come up with some really memorable and clever motifs. In particular, I'd like to call attention to Mercedes' drumming. Like, she really has a voice as a drummer on this album. The main part for the title song. I've never heard a drum part phrased in this music like that before. In isolation, you wouldn't really think it would work with that weird little pause in there that she does, but it works. It's such an instantly iconic part. Like, it gives it this lurching, train off the tracks feel to the song that I love so much. and this song wouldn't be the same with any other drum beat. Like, this is what Spit is supposed to sound like. And this is what Spit sounds like with just, a typical halftime plain nu metal / post-grunge rock beat. No, it doesn't work anymore. That drum part's just so distinctive. The same thing with Do You Think I'm a Whore? Most heavy 2000s rock drummers would have just put a halftime plain beat over this, but not Mercedes. A little unorthodox of a phrasing, sure, but again, it works. It makes the song distinctive. And even in other more standard halftime settings, she still has a voice. Trippin'. So the intro's kind of intense, but then it just goes right into, again, this lumbering, lurching feel. And then on Charlotte. It's got another pretty intense intro. And then when it's time for halftime in the verses, she hits those 3 dotted eighth notes on the snare. It's so cool. I can't really explain why it's cool, but it's just cool. Like I'm talking about it, and when the words come out of my mouth, it sounds like I'm describing mundane things, but it just feels different to me. Something about it feels different from other nu metal music of the time, and I love it so much. She's got a unique voice with double pedals too. Speaking as a mediocre drummer, I think it's probably partially because she hadn't quite mastered the double pedal yet. Like, there aren't really any lengthy double bass drum runs on this album. There's pretty much just little licks here and there, but those little licks are great. It all comes together into a really cool voice on the drums. This album is so full of iconic parts, man. Like the breakdown after the second chorus of Charlotte, where it gets all atmospheric, and it's got an amazing sense of melody, and it's actually kind of beautiful. Simple, but beautiful. The fast, screamy bit in Brackish. They did way more with that Cold Chamber riff than Cold Chamber ever did. There's a reason why Brackish was chosen to be the single, and there's a reason why it was the big hit from this thing. The bass lick in Raven before the chorus kicks in. The tension in the breakdown from Suck. There's really only one true miss in the track list, and that's Immortal, the final song, which is really only a miss because it's a keyboard-laced instrumental piece that really does nothing for the album experience that could have easily been left off the album. And of course, not to say that the album is absolutely perfect in every other way, of course. You gotta remember, in a vacuum, a lot of the performances are pretty rough. You can still hear how weak Mercedes' hit strength is. It's kind of weird at times to hear these piddly little drum hits against the very loud backdrop of everything else. It's kind of awkward from time to time. And Morgan's vocal performance is also pretty rough. You know, her harsh vocals are little more than strained hoarse yells. Like she's just nervously screaming into the microphone, like not really letting it go as much as she could. Her clean singing kind of leaves something to be desired as well, but it's not as bad as it could be. Actually, the clean singing's pretty alright. It's kind of weird to me that Morgan got the lead vocal role when there is a song on this album that demonstrates that at this point in time there was clearly a superior vocalist in the band. That song is called Choke. That's the one song on which Fallon Bowman takes the lead vocal role. And she sounds goddamn venomous on this track, man. Morgan just can't compare. Like, holy shit. Obviously, Morgan would figure out how to actually sing and scream in just a short time after this album's making, but as rough as the vocals are on this album, I just can't hate them. I can't even bring myself to be annoyed by them. Again, it's a distinct element. If there was more technically competent vocals on this album, it wouldn't sound the way it does. It wouldn't sound as unique as it does. And it's for that reason as well that at the end of the day, none of this album's performance issues really matter to me. You know, again, remember who was making this thing. People who were 15, 16, and 17 years old. They were all still pretty new to their instruments. They were all still pretty new to songwriting. But they still performed the album to the level of any other more professional and experienced band in the day. And all the imperfections just contribute to the album sounding completely unique. Not only is this album goddamn impressive for the age that its creators were, it's goddamn impressive, period. You combine the themes, you combine the writing sensibility, you combine the distinctive elements for better or worse, and altogether, you get something that stands head and shoulders above the dregs of scumbag nu metal and post-grunge music at the time. You know, nu metal is music of youthful rage, and more than anyone else, Kittie's take on nu metal was a great capture of youthful rage because they actually were young and angry for a reason when they made it. It's got way more substance lyrically, while fitting right in with typical nu metal lyrical stylings. And it's a message that's still relevant and still stands up today. It's got none of the crappy macho attitude because it's not made by dudes. Everything ends up just being right. Like, what more could I possibly want? There's only one really, truly unfortunate thing about this record, though, and that's that it's the only Kittie record that sounds the way it does. As the 2000s wore on, Kittie got tired of, being pigeonholed as a nu metal band. They wanted to be taken more seriously with their songwriting and musicianship, and, obviously Morgan figured out how to sing and scream. So the future albums got more technically competent in the musicianship department. They got more ambitious with songwriting. They ventured into other more technical areas of metal. But at the same time, I feel like they also lost their voice. Like, I can tell you what the Kittie sound is for this album. I can't tell you the Kittie sound for any other Kittie album, really. Oracle still kind of had some of that nu metal sensibility left over. I think they burned up the last of the leftover aggression they had from Spit on that album. And there's one or two tracks from the new album, Fire, that kind of sound like they could stand up there with that era of Kittie as well. But other than that, their discography outside of Spit is mostly a blur and doesn't really mean all that much to me. Yes, from a technical standpoint, they did get better after Spit, but Spit was just goddamn lightning in a bottle, man. This was Kittie's moment that they never had again. And there's a reason why Spit is what everybody remembers them for. It's the greatest nu metal album of all time. To wrap this up, I'm going to go ahead and say that I know what this sounds like. I know that this video probably just sounds like a giant backhanded compliment, like, oh, this album sucks, but it's good because it sucks. And I know that I've spent a lot of time talking shit about nu metal and its related genres, but like, I'm telling the truth here. Like, that I legitimately love Spit for the reasons that I've already stated. And the fact that this album has managed to be as legendary as it is and have the stature that it does, despite the, you know, the shortcomings that it has, I really think that says something about its quality. And that's pretty much all I wanted to say about the album. That is my conclusion. I'd love to hear what your thoughts on the album are. I'd love to hear your stories of nu metal, getting into it, you know, what your favorite albums from the genre are. And I'd also love it if you'd subscribe and like the video. Even though this is kind of a departure from the usual content on this channel, I still intend on keeping this primarily a hobbyist recording channel, but at the same time I also want to expand my horizons a little bit and do some videos about just about music stuff that I'm passionate about, like commentary. I don't want to go full-on Fantano, but recording videos are hard to put together, and I do have a lot of thoughts about music, so I plan on doing at least a little bit more of this kind of stuff in the future. So if you want to see that in the future, or if you want to watch my hobbyist recording stuff and get more of that, then subscribe and check out my other stuff. That's all I've got for you for today. Take good care of yourselves, everybody. I'm out of here.